Well, cool. Mike, did you have any notes by way of introduction?
No, I have no announcements other than just say thanks for leading us and hand it over to you.
Okay, cool. Well, sorry for that delay. My fancy Bluetooth headphones, that's the second time they've kicked off towards the beginning of a Zoom meeting, but I am here now. And thanks to all of y'all who are watching or joining here on Zoom right now. And I'm sure there'll be some people watching online later. But it is good to see y'all. I'm excited for our night 2 of 3 for Beyond Belief, of course, on what Christianity can be. So for anyone who's watching tonight, joining us tonight who wasn't here last week, my name is Tyler Heston. I'm one of the pastors here at Country Club Christian Church. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I do a few things at the church, but since the beginning, I've been working with our youth ministry, which includes a program called the Pastor's Class, which does a few things, but one of the main things it does is offer our 6th graders an overview of what it means to be Christian, so that they can ask some of the big questions about life and faith before they get baptized every year. So this is part 2 of 3 of Beyond Belief, which is a sort of shorter version of the Pastor's Class curriculum. As we get started for our second lesson, I want to make sure you have something to write on in front of you. So you may want to grab a pen and paper or just open up like a text dialog box, a note app on your phone or something like that on your phone or computer. There'll be a couple moments to write down some reflections, or you may just want to take notes. Second, if you go to the chat or if you go to this link that you see on your screen, bit.ly/beyondbelief2, you can find a handout for tonight. Zoom won't let me send it through our chat, but I'll email it to you afterwards as well, so you can have another place with notes and a little book list. And then the last thing that I want to remind you, we are recording tonight if you missed that, so we can share this on YouTube for people to watch afterwards. And a reminder just for our ease tonight, if you are not actively talking, which are a couple moments in which you'll be invited to respond, I'll ask you to stay muted just so everyone can hear me. And yeah, so any questions before we dive in, or any technical issues we're having? Cool. Well, last week we talked about, for our first lesson last week, our theme was creator. We talked about what we talk about when we talk about God. And the main theme, if you missed it or didn't watch last week's, is that there are many different ways that we can describe God. There are countless images for God. And our journeys of faith are not about finding out the right, perfect way to talk about God, but rather joining this group, this rich history within, across our species of exploring who God might be, and that we get to imagine God in new and exciting ways every day of our life. So last week we talked a little bit about what we talk about when we talk about God. Tonight we are going to talk about Christ. We're going to do 2 parts with this. So first we're going to talk about what the Gospels tell us about who Jesus was, and then we're going to talk about what it means for Christ to be risen. Depending on time, I have another little lesson that we do in Pastor's Class about this word called contrition that we'll do. So we'll see if time allows, but if not, we're going to talk about Jesus and talk about Christ, or talk about Jesus Christ and kind of tangle out or disentangle the ways in which those names have become so combined. So as we dive in, I have a question. If you could write a biography about anyone, who would it be? Maybe think or write down on a piece of paper or a piece of your technology. What are 2 or 3 things you'd say about this person? And what would you title it? So if you could write a biography about anyone, who would it be? What would you want to include? What would you title it? Feel free to share any responses in the chat, or if 1 or 2 of us wants to speak up, I would love to hear someone that you would like to write a biography on.
This is Vicki, and so many people come to mind, but one of them would be Oscar Wilde. And there's, of course, been a lot written about him, but I find him fascinating, and I don't know what I would title it, but what I would want to learn is more about the non-sensational part of his life.
I like that. Thank you, Vicky. Mike, what would you name your biography on Soren Kierkegaard?
Slipping up on the truth.
Slipping up on the truths. I like it. Ooh, Neil deGrasse Tyson and Just the Facts. I would read your biography on Neil deGrasse Tyson, John. Well, thank y'all. I want you to keep this in the back of your mind as we move forward, because tonight, in order to talk about Jesus, I think the place that makes the most sense to start are the closest things that we have to his own biographies, which are the Gospels and the New Testament. But before we talk about those, I wonder, what do you think Jesus looked like? According to a quick Google search, this seems to be the first image that pops into a lot of people's mind when they think about Jesus. I see a lot of blonde and white people, brown hair, some blue eyes. This Jesus looks 6'2", looks more like a beauty model than at least who I think Jesus actually looked like. There is one Comedy Central TV show ad that snuck its way into this Google search. It may look more like historical Jesus, but I think, as all of us know, Jesus was not a blonde hair, blue eyes, cute smile type of man, but probably looked more something like this. Jesus was an ancient Palestinian man who lived in the peasant country of the Roman Empire, and he was not the Roman man that has come to characterize a lot of who people think about when they think about Jesus. But the truth is that we don't have many historical resources for knowing who Jesus was, much less what he looked like. We do know that Jesus grew up in Nazareth in Galilee, which we as Christians are familiar with those terms, but that was a really inconsequential location within the Roman Empire. There were only a couple of remarks made about Jesus outside of early Christians' resources and sources. There were actually many other movements around this part of the Roman Empire and all throughout the Roman Empire that, at least on the surface, looked like Jesus and his ragtag group of disciples. But we do have a place that we can go to learn a little bit more about who Jesus was, and those are the Gospels in the Christian Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, as you may know, the word gospel comes from a Greek word that means good news. And the Gospels are the four accounts that we have of the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. I like to talk about the Gospels as biographies, but we have to be careful when we talk about them as biographies and distinguish them from the type of biographies that we read today. So think about the biographies that you thought about at the beginning of class. What were you more concerned with? Were you more concerned with the historical and detailed accuracy of these stories? Or were you more concerned with thinking about stories that contain meaning and memory? Whenever I've thought about who I'd like to write a biography about, the first people that come to mind are friends and family members, because I want their stories to be shared, not because of the historical facts, but more because of the memory and meaning. And that's a lot of what undergirds the Gospels and the way that they are a biography about Jesus. They're less concerned with the stats and facts about the historical Jesus, and we're more interested in the meaning behind its story. So ancient biographies are actually a type of genre that we see in ancient literature. Some people just call them ancient bios, using the Greek word for life. But these were a common type of writing in the Greco-Roman era that were collections of carefully curated stories about philosophers, about politicians, or about other people with influence that were written to persuade people into some sort of response in their own life. Ancient biographies were known to have careful plot and narrative structures, but they were never understood as accurate records of what actually happened. The characters in ancient biographies were caricatures of how readers should or should not act in their own hearts, in their own life, and they were not people that were meant to be proven as existing. The stories were shaped to tell what was true in the hearts, lives, and communities of the people who first wrote and read the Gospels, and not just what was true in a modern understanding of history. So there were ancient biographies written about all sorts of people, philosophers and politicians, but scholars usually point out that these Gospels, that Jesus' ancient biographies, are pretty unique, though they do have some things in common, particularly with the ancient biographies about politicians. The word gospel itself was not a word that Christians invented, but was rather one that many people used for the good news of Roman rulers and kings. So we know that Jesus existed, but we don't go to the Gospels to find out the exact history. We go instead for the story of Jesus, and we go to find ourselves among the characters that followed him in these ancient tales. So I want to look a bit about the content of the Gospels, about what they say. But before they do, I want to offer a quick note on how they were composed. So I think I mentioned this in our Q&A last week, but here's a little timeline of when the Gospels were each written compared to when Jesus was born and crucified. We don't have exact dates. So scholars think that Jesus was born around 5 BCE and died around 30 CE. But it took about 40 years for the first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, to start being circulated around early Christian communities. Scholars think that Matthew came next just 10 or 20 years later, with John another 10 or 20 years after that. And people are kind of undecided about where Luke fit in. A lot of scholars think that it was written about the same time as the Gospel of Matthew. My Bible professor in seminary argued that it was written around 120 CE, so I'm going to go with Dr. Shelley Matthews in that one. But regardless, the point is there was a lot of time in between Jesus' life and death and resurrection and the time that these Gospels were being circulated as like completed books. This shows us that people had a lot of time to think about what Jesus meant to them as individuals in their life and what Jesus meant to their community. So I like comparing this timeline to a little techie timeline that I kind of created myself. But when we look back in the recent history, the first computer that we ever really had was made in 1938. It wasn't until 1978 that beloved Mac got into the market with creating the first Apple computer. And then it took another 20 years before that, after that, before desktops and laptops and all of the technology that we have now were part of our homes. And it was still not until 2008, the first iPhone was released that changed the game on personal technology. And so we look at the 60 years or 70 years between the first computer and the first iPhone, and we can think about how much of the world has changed, both in regards to technology, but in regards to so much else. And then when we see that's a similar time difference between Jesus' birth and the first gospel of being written. So there was about 40 years between the crucifixion and the Gospel of Mark, but there was about 75 years between Jesus' birth and that gospel being written. And there was a lot that went on in the world. There was a lot of time for people to really think about and curate and reflect on what Jesus meant to them. So these biographies, these gospels represent years and years of people thinking about and deciding what was important to be passed down. They weren't books written to convince people necessarily to join the movement, but were books that were passed down to remind people why they had joined in the first place. And so there's a lot in there that was written for people in 70, 80, 90, and 100 CE that represents this tradition that had been built before them. Another point about the Gospels is though they're all named after one person, most likely each of them was more created by a church or a group of churches or leaders within those churches. Scholars often use words like the Johannine community or the Johannine church or the Lucan community to talk about these communities that put forward the Gospels. Like, again, they were written for Christians reflecting on what it meant to be Christian. But another thing important to point out about the creation of the Gospels is there was more than just sheer time that happened between Jesus and these books being written. There was some trauma and tragedy, particularly in those few years right before the Gospel of Mark was written. Just in 66 CE, there was a huge revolt in Jerusalem of Jewish people against the Roman Empire. After one of their high priests was stabbed in the middle of the temple and died, people, like all the tensions that had been within the Jewish people for years because of the Roman rule, burst, and Jewish people started to fight back. That led to, as you might guess, some retaliation from the Roman Empire, who ended up destroying Jerusalem, killing tens of thousands of people, and destroyed the temple, the Jewish temple, which was more than just a fancy and expensive building that a lot of people went to, but was where people said God was located. So these few years were huge for the Jewish world, for parts of the Roman Empire, and were really significant for Christianity, which at that time was still a part of Judaism. It hadn't really broken off to its own movement. And so the Gospels were first assembled during this traumatic and terrible time in which small decisions really had big implications. How close would this emerging Christianity identify with these revolutionary groups? What would they make out of the Roman resistance and the Roman retaliation? So these gospels didn't come overnight as eyewitness accounts of who Jesus was, but rather offer us a rich access to what people were talking about when they talk about Jesus in those first decades of Christianity. We won't get into all the specifics of the Gospels tonight, all of their nuances, or even how I might offer a thesis for each of them. But instead, I want to look briefly at the content of each of them. As you may know, the Gospels are each kind of different, each have a lot of similarities, but each of them does this. They tell stories about the life, not the lie, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus from Nazareth. So first, the Gospels tell stories of Jesus' life. You may be surprised to know that only 2 of the Gospels tell of Jesus' birth, Matthew and Luke. Mark just starts out with adult Jesus, and John starts out with this beautiful poem, then launches into Jesus' adult ministry. Scholars suggest that the first few decades of Christianity, people weren't too concerned about Jesus' childhood, and it was only as it became more institutionalized that these stories were being asked. And so these stories were being created and curated and got into Matthew and Luke, but not all of the Gospels. All of the Gospels, when they talk about Jesus' life, they were more concerned with what he did in his ministries. He was traveling around Galilee, around these peasant towns, and as he was teaching and healing. Jesus first taught all sorts of people that God is not only found in religious buildings or accessed through rules. Jesus taught that God is with and within us all. And there are a few examples in the Gospels in which Jesus is talking through these eloquent speeches, but more often, Jesus is pictured as teaching through parables, short stories that used images from everyday life that made people think twice about the world that they lived in. As Jesus taught and healed throughout his life in these stories, we see Jesus teaching that God cares about us, especially through these healings and miracles, from the healings of physical ailments to the miracles like the multiplication of bread and fish. These things taught that God cared, but they were significant specifically because of their social implications. Almost all of Jesus' miracles, if not every single one, functioned to remove something in someone's life that was limiting them socially or economically. The miracles did more than heal something physically. It removed a social and economic barrier. I was just reading the other day the story of the man who was paralyzed, couldn't walk, whose friends brought him to get healed from Jesus, and they saw that the house was really busy, so they carved out the hole in the roof and let their friend down, and he was healed. It's a beautiful story, but it's easy to miss the full reality of what that man had just experienced. Not only could he walk and go about his life, but he was allowed so much more access to the social, religious, and economic world around him. And when Jesus told him that his sins had been forgiven, he was more than inviting this man into a new internal state, but he was proclaiming his sins were forgiven so he could go about the world, a world in which at that time there were all these regulations for people who were and weren't forgiven. And so the parable, or Jesus' teaching and healing, invited people to see God everywhere they went and functioned to give people access to more flourishing and more social and community life. It's really important to note that as Jesus teaches and heals, not just what he says and what he does, but who Jesus is with throughout this. I wonder, what type of people do you know Jesus hung out with in the stories? Maybe throw a couple examples in the chat. Tax collectors, yes. It's the first one that always comes to mind. I think throughout the Gospels, it often says that Jesus was seen with tax collectors and sinners. Throughout the Gospels, throughout all these stories, so sex workers, sinners, poor people, ill people, all sorts of things. The type of people that Jesus hung out with in his life in these stories and these biographies we have of him were people that the world thought were sinners, from people that were labeled as bad for what they did for money, what their past was, for how much money they did not have. Greg, I hadn't even thought of that in preparation tonight. Jesus was seen as hanging out with people like the Samaritans, who were of a different people than the Jewish people, and they were kind of enemies. Jesus also hung out with people with that were more complicated than the bad guys we might picture today. So tax collectors and Pharisees. Pharisees is a fancy word for a type of Jewish religious leader. These tax collectors and Pharisees and others were officials that had other Jewish people sold out to the Roman Empire, choosing to benefit from their own people's oppression. So when it talks about Jesus hanging out with tax collectors, it's more than getting mad at the people who take our money each year. These tax collectors and Pharisees represented Jewish leaders who had, to many, betrayed their own people because they were benefiting from the Roman oppression that kept the rest of their people poor. So when we look at the people who Jesus hung out with as he taught and healed, we see that that God prioritizes those who are poor, those who are cast out by society, and that God loves those who we consider as enemies. Jesus didn't only hang out with poor people. He hung out with some wealthy people too. But what was significant about that was all the people that were his disciples wouldn't have been seen with these Pharisees and tax collectors because they were enemies to the peasants that Jesus was teaching and healing. As we know, though, the Gospels don't end with stories of Jesus' life. They move on to tell about his death. And it's in talking about his death that each of the four Gospels start to tell the story with a little more synchronicity. For example, all four of the Gospels include a story of Jesus cleansing the temple. He goes into the temple in Jerusalem. He's angry at seeing all of the money exchanging that's going on and how it's gotten away from the heart of worship. And he brandishes a whip, casts out the animals, and flips over the table. This is not the nice Jesus we always picture. All four of the Gospels tell this, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke each use this scene to introduce the Passion narrative, which is a scholarly term for the series of stories that lead up to the crucifixion. Key to the Passion narrative is the triumphal entry, or the Palm Sunday story that we read and celebrate every year. More than just a moment in the Gospels, this act of Jesus entering into the city of Jerusalem, the Jewish capital at that time, was a subversive act that looked like what Roman kings and rulers did. So when Jesus entered Jerusalem, this capital city of his own people, he was doing so in a way that would catch much more attention than the attention he had got from the peasant communities he had been traveling and teaching in and healing in. Of course, this triumphal entry and so much of what Jesus had taught and healed about the kingdom of God was seen as dangerous to political and some religious leaders. And his entry and the things that he taught, ticked them off. This is what ultimately led him to be crucified. Scholars focus on these two moments of the cleansing of the temple and the triumphal entry as probably the historical moments that caught Rome's attention and led Jesus to be crucified. The crucifixion itself, as you can guess, is a complicated story. We can talk about so much, from Judas's role to all the dynamics of politics and religion that went into Jesus being led to that cross. But it's a story in which the leaders thought they were putting an end. So the Roman officials thought they were putting an end to the danger within their revolutionary ideas that Jesus taught and embodied throughout his ministry. There are many meanings that we can pull from the crucifixion. I don't think there's just one thing that it means for us, but perhaps the best place to start is the idea or the image that we get that no matter what happens, we are still found within God's story. Jesus himself felt abandoned at the cross. We get this picture, this scene in which he cries, oh God, why have you forsaken me?" And he felt abandoned by his followers too. In all four of the gospel accounts, most of Jesus' disciples flee and abandon him. And it's only a small band of women, including his mother, some of his other disciples' mothers, who stay with him. So Jesus himself felt abandoned. Jesus himself went through death. And this is a reminder to us that we are a part of God's story, no matter how bad things get. The good news of the Gospels, and I think for us, is that the Gospels don't end with Jesus' death. They move on to talk about his resurrection. So I wonder, take a minute to yourself and think about what words, what images, what comes to mind when you think about resurrection? I always think about spring and lilies, as I suggest with this image of the lily cross from our own church. But resurrection has become one of the guiding ethoses for us as Christians. And it means a lot of different things. But the Gospels each tell a story, their own take on the story, but a story of resurrection. Mark may be my favorite. It's the shortest Gospel. It's a little clumsy sometimes, and it actually doesn't end with the sighting of the risen Christ. The original ending to Mark ends with the woman finding his tomb and fleeing in terror, which sometimes the good news of resurrection scares me like that. But each of the stories is a bit different, but contains an empty tomb and someone saying that they have seen the risen Christ. Resurrection can mean many things to us, but within these stories, it means that death does not have the last word, that Jesus' story did not stop when he was crucified. What God started, Rome did not end, and Jesus' ministry lived on through his resurrection, through those that followed him. Over the year, Christians have expanded and grown this idea of resurrection to be so much more than something that happened to a single body. And we've learned to see resurrection throughout our world in a variety of ways. So the second half of our lesson tonight is going to kind of be unpacking what we mean when we talk about resurrection, or we proclaim what we see within the Gospels, that Christ is risen. But before we do that, I want to offer us a few minutes to kind of look deeper at one part of these ancient biographies. So I've selected one passage from each of the four Gospels that you now see on your screen. And I want to give us about 5 minutes to open up our Bibles, either on a computer or if we have a physical one handy, and look at this passage and just reflect on it and think, does this tell a story of Jesus' life, Jesus' death, or Jesus' resurrection? And what does it say about that? So I'll give us about 5 minutes to do that. But if anyone has a question, feel free to pop one out. So I want to offer a couple more minutes for y'all to read these passages and reflect. But as we do so, I'm wondering if anyone has a remark they'd like to make about the passage that they selected, or another question. Teresa, I see your question. How do you interpret the tearing of the temple curtain at Jesus' death? You're reminding me of moments in seminary and since then in which I'm like, I really wanted search that deeper because I've never really spent time dwelling on the temple curtain tearing since I was a kid and was grown up teaching this. As a kid, I was taught that meant that God was done with Judaism now and was only concerned with Christianity, which may be obviously how I don't read it now. It's been a while since I've thought about the tearing of the temple curtain. Mike might have, our scholar in residence might have some more insight to drop, but I think I've seen scholars talk about it being a more vague, just kind of note on the drama of Jesus' death, this sign that Jesus' death was a cosmic event, and not just another person being crucified. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, like somebody chatted, there's the drama of it, but there's also the notion of direct access. Most theologians, biblical scholars would say that that's not a factual thing as much as a way to tell the story. The historians of that day certainly didn't validate that the curtain was torn, but it makes for a really powerful image of, the thing that separated us from access to God in that sense.
Thank you, Mike.
Same thing for the earthquakes, it's cataclysmic kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of those things. I remember growing up and thinking how did this actually happen? Or am I supposed to go through and watch that chant thing online that I saw once? It teaches us the science behind how this happened, and seeing them as those ancient biographies helps us see that they're embellishments that mean something deeper than a factual moment, and thus when we see them as that, we can see them as more expansive and more there's more than one meaning to some things. But yeah, thank you. Let's move on to the second half of Christ, in which we're going to kind of disentangle this proclamation that's at the heart of Christian faith, that Christ is risen. And so think to yourself, when would you say that Christianity began? Did it begin when Jesus was born? Did it begin when he died? Did it begin when the first church was organized? Or did it begin sometime later when people started using the word Christian or this or that, the other? To me, and I've seen others argue this as well, I think that Christianity was born the first time or the first moment that someone proclaimed that they had seen the risen Christ, or proclaimed this, that Christ is risen. Now, we don't have record of when or where or from whom this proclamation came first, not exactly. Each of the Gospels tells the story of the resurrection a little bit different, with some people saying it first, or other people there's some people not saying it at all, but just seeing an empty tomb. But scholars think that the oldest tradition, or that the first tradition, was that Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus's main disciples, and one of those women who, in all four of the Gospels, did not abandon Jesus at the cross, that she was the first person to come across the empty tomb and proclaim that Christ is risen. So it's the first time that someone proclaimed that Christ is risen. Christians have proclaiming over and over again that Christ is risen, not only with words, but through embodied actions and through their communities of transformation and of care. To look at this phrase that Christ is risen tonight, I want to offer a few vocabulary words that we need to define in order to talk about Jesus becoming Christ. And first is, what does Christ mean? So Christ comes from a Greek word Christos, which means anointed one. And it's really just the Greek version of the Jewish word Messiah, which means the same thing. So the word Messiah is a heavy word within Jewish tradition, and it represents a long tradition of Jewish people hoping for a saving figure, a liberating figure. There's a rich tradition behind this idea of Messiah, one that was never completely agreed on. There's a variety of understandings of this messianic hope, this hope for a Messiah, both within ancient and modern Judaism. Some Jewish people around Jesus' time and before thought there was going to be a literal Messiah, while others said that the term was something used more broadly for the different people through whom God works. Something I want to point out, though, is both of these terms, Christ and Messiah, synonyms in different languages, implied something politically. Because of this history within Judaism of this hope for salvation and liberation, these words, Messiah and Christ, don't just represent something that's a person's internal state or feeling. It represents this Jewish longing for independence and freedom, this salvation that Jewish people hoped for regarded their land and political identity and the whole of their community identity, not just something for individuals. Before Jesus, the ancient Israelites had spent centuries under different exiles, and during Jesus' time, there was a spectrum of grief and resistance from the Roman rule. That brings us to a third word that gets thrown around a lot when we talk about Jesus being Christ, and that's the word Lord. This word comes from the Greek word kyrios, which means Lord, or more broadly, ruler. But I want to note that in Jesus' time, this wasn't an obscure word that was only used in religious or Jewish connotations. Rather, this was a word that was commonly used for kings and rulers across the Roman Empire. When Jesus was alive, when he was teaching, and in those first generations after his crucifixion and resurrection, it was common to hear proclamations like, Caesar is Lord. So when Christians started saying Jesus is Lord, they were saying something that was seen as treason to Rome. They were pledging allegiance to a different rule than the one that Rome enforced. They were saying that some of this messianic hope for a new way of being in the world had been found in this one named Jesus. Throughout the first generations of Christianity, these words Christ and Lord became titles for Jesus. Christians knew that to follow Jesus' teachings and be a part of the community that followed him meant changing this or claiming this long line of hope found within Jewish tradition and ascribing to a new social and political system that went up and against the oppressive hierarchy of Roman rule. These titles became so important because of a very related idea that Jesus was more than just another human who happened to be some special agent for God. And early Christians began using these titles along with the idea that Jesus was God himself. Was Jesus actually God? This question to some makes or breaks Christianity. To others, like us at Country Club, we believe that there's a variety of ways to faithfully answer this question. And people within our own community and probably in this own class have different answers to this question. Core to Christianity is the idea of incarnation, that God incarnates or takes on human flesh. Throughout the first centuries of Christianity, particularly once it became more institutionalized after its first 100 years, there was a lot of dialogue, a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion about what exactly this idea of incarnation meant for Jesus' own flesh and blood. Some church officials ended up deciding that they had it figured out and deciding that Jesus was literally God with this complex metaphysical argument around it, but it took decades for them to reach that consensus, meaning there was never absolute agreement, always different ways in which people interpreted this message of incarnation. Incarnation fundamentally is a mystery. Any claim of God taking on human flesh requires things like faith and an openness to wonder and mystery. But I want to connect our conversation now to something we talked about last week, something called Pan-Intheism, that idea that everything is in God and that God is in everything. To me, a panentheistic understanding of incarnation changes the game a little bit. Whether or not it decenters this question of whether or not Jesus was God and brings a whole new perspective. Instead of asking whether or not Jesus was the same thing of a monotheistic God who is the supreme being that lives outside the universe but is somehow connected and involved with it, a panentheistic understanding of the incarnation sees the incarnation as the fundamental reality of the world we live in. Last week, we talked a bit about how the world is God's body, or the universe is God's self-portrait. Everything in the panentheistic lens is incarnation. So, of course, Jesus was God and Jesus was part of the incarnation. However, the incarnation didn't stop there. And this approach to incarnation becomes the other side to the coin of resurrection. Instead of simple historical claims about past events, to say that God had incarnated in Jesus or that Christ is risen is to proclaim something about where God is located and what God is up to in our world today. Where is God located? According to the stories of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, God is located on the margins of society and within those trying to build a new way in the world. We believe that God is everywhere, but we see God specifically located in the places where Jesus walked and taught. God is incarnate through all people, then we need to look especially at those through whom our society has written off, those people in whom the image of God has been diminished because of the economics and social practices of the world. These things too, this idea of an incarnation like this tells us and that Christ is risen. These things tell us that the oppressive systems in our world cannot put to death that which God is doing. Systems like the Roman Empire that proclaimed itself this reign of peace while 80% of its citizens were poor and the world was rife with all sorts of tension and terror. These oppressive rules won't overcome the justice and flourishing that God wants for all people, which is what Jesus taught about and embodied in his own life and ministry. When we proclaim that Christ is risen, we proclaim that the forces like the very ones who put Jesus to death are powerless in the wake of God who is within and with everyone and everything. So more than a belief that we must ascribe to or a dogma that we gotta agree with, Christ is risen is a conviction and proclamation that locates God where we find Jesus in the Gospels, with those cast out by the Roman kingdom and among those trying to build a new world from the inside out. To me, this means that resurrection and salvation, these two words that we use a lot as Christians, are not one-time experiences in the past or one-time moments in our own journeys of faith. They are ongoing realities with which we strive to become more in tune through everything that we do. So instead of deliberating this much further, I want to wrap up this conversation about resurrection and what it means for Christ to be risen with a couple of quotes that help me make sense of this idea. I'll take some questions now and we can talk some more after class. And next week, as we talk a little bit more about what it means to be Christian, we'll think about what it means for us to embody Christ is risen through our life and actions. But for now, I want to first show you a quote from an author named Jane Shaberg, a feminist biblical scholar who, if you took my class on Mary Magdalene last year, you probably heard me quote this book that this resurrection comes from, or this quote about resurrection comes from. But she offers to me what is one of the most poignant descriptions of resurrection faith in talking about what it means to believe in resurrection today. And she says, "Do I believe in the resurrection of the dead? Yes, actually, I do. I also know that I will die. Resurrection is for me a broken and living myth, an outrageous hope grounded in belief in the God who gives life to the dead. It is grounded also in the invigorating, stubborn moments of struggling against multiple aspects of oppression and against self-righteousness. Scientific knowledge, in my opinion, makes this faith no more outrageous than it was in past ages, when people were intimately acquainted with the stink and rot of death and with injustice. Resurrection is a concept of sublime courage and optimism. It locates redemption where ultimate horror also resides, in pain, mutilation, death, and decay." So this quote on resurrection comes from after a moment in which Jane Shaberg is talking about how she's struggling. I think at the time her mom had cancer and her mom asked her, she was a Catholic biblical scholar. She asked Jane, "Hey, do you believe in resurrection?" And Jane says that she stammers for an answer, offering some scholarly reflection on what it means. And then she realizes resurrection, more than whatever we can prove or disprove about the past, is a deeper mystery than some historical argument. And it's this bold claim that invigorates life. The second quote I want to offer comes from a book called Making a Way Out of No Way by an author, Monica Coleman, who uses this phrase, creative transformation, to talk about the fundamental activity of God. She talks about how Christ has become this way of talking about that which God does in the world to work towards creative transformation, to work towards healing and hope and harmony. And we discover this through the stories of Jesus. She says, Christ is that power of transformation, the process of change itself. She says, Christ is positive change for the new. Christ is not reducible to Jesus, but we can discern Christ in Jesus in a unique way. As people focus on Jesus, they become more and more open to creative transformation. So I want to offer a couple moments to reflect on this. I'm going to throw a short selection from the Luke version of the resurrection. And I either invite you to spend a couple minutes reading this and meditating on the idea of resurrection and what it means to you as more than a one-time event in the past, but as the reality that we live in. You're welcome down to write down any insights that are popping up or a definition of resurrection. Or if you have a question, feel free to throw one in the chat or ask one. And then like 3 or 4 minutes, we'll gather back up for our last little conversation. One of the things that always stands out to me when I read the resurrection narratives, especially this one tonight, is just the surprise, the words like perplexed and suddenly and dazzling. It says, we think about the word resurrection. A lot of times I think about the world outside of us and how every year the world resurrection, we see this physical idea that resurrection is the fundamental reality of the world. But sometimes when I think about those more natural images for resurrection, I forget about how jarring and surprising resurrection is in the New Testament. And this proclamation that Christ is risen is more than just something that gives us warm fuzzies, but it's something that shakes us out of our seats and shakes us into a new way of life. And that's going to be the theme of this last 10 minutes of class. Before we move on, I do want to note the one question I saw in chat was the use of Lord a political statement. In short, yes, the word Lord did have political overtones. Something important to note, in America today, we see like the separation of religion and politics, which we know they're connected, but we as a society seek to see the two things as separate, though related things. Well, in Jesus' world, religion and politics were much more merry. They were much more intertwined, and people really didn't think about them as separately as we think about them today. So Lord was more than just a sheer political statement. It carried a different weight than like president carries today. But if someone overheard someone saying Jesus is Lord when they knew Caesar is Lord, it would kind of be around or be something like hearing like so-and-so is president when we know someone else is president right now. There's actually a book called Jesus is President by Shane Claiborne that I haven't read in ages, but introduced me to that idea in like high school, and has a catchy phrase because Jesus for president, what does that mean? But I want to offer for our last 10 minutes of class, a way to think about what all of this means, what Christ is risen, what the stories of Jesus mean for us as we go about our lives. Like I said, the Gospels weren't written to get us to the exact history of what actually happened, but were written as these dynamic and compelling stories that invite us to follow Jesus in our own ways in our lives today. And so if you were taking the actual pastor's class along with the sixth graders, we would have a whole hour lesson about this word called contrition. You may know what the word contrition is. You may not know what the word contrition is. Our pastor's class youth always get assigned homework to go home the week before and learn what this word means. And they find out that it's a fancy, churchy word for the word repentance or turning away from. Repentance itself is another fancy, churchy word. So contrition is a fancy word for repentance. And if we want to talk about repentance, we have to talk about sin. So I invite you just for a second, close your eyes and think to yourself, what do you think about when you think about sin? What pictures come to mind? What feelings come to mind? What stories? How would you define sin? So you can open your eyes now. Sin is a complex word that mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And in order for us to get an understanding of what that word means tonight, let's go back to its roots. So we get the word sin from an ancient Greek word used in the Bible, hamartia. A good translation of this word is to miss the mark. So when I hear this definition of the word sin, to miss the mark, I think of archery. Archery has been around forever, and it was played during the time that the Bible was written. So people knew what it meant to miss the mark. Missing the mark might not be getting the arrow only slightly outside of the bullseye, or it may be really missing it, like missing the entire target itself. If we understand sin as missing the mark, then we have a more expansive understanding of what sin is. It's more than just a long list of things we shouldn't do, but it includes a lot of different things that can be talked about in a lot of different ways, from personal sins to communal sins to things that affect us all. Tonight, I want to offer us 3 categories of sin. I'm not saying that God is up in the sky keeping record of everyone's sins like Santa Claus, categorizing it into one of 3 categories. Rather, I think these 3 categories kind of help us understand the many ways in which sin happens. So the first way to think about sin or about missing the mark is thinking about it as the bad things that we do. This is kind of the default understanding of sin. When we say someone's a sinner, we're talking about someone who is characterized by the bad things they've done throughout their life. We may think of things like lying or stealing or bullying people or hurting people physically. But I think, too, the bad things that we do include things that harm ourselves or things that harm the world we live in, harm non-human life. Second, sin is the good things that we don't do. In the book of James, it says, anyone who knows the right thing to do and fails to do it commits sin. So not doing, or sin is the good things that we don't do, might be things like not helping a friend in need, not taking care of yourself, not standing up for injustice when you see it in the world. But sin, this missing the mark, is not only the bad things that we do, it's the good things that we don't do. And it's kind of even more expansive than that. Sin, in some ways, is like a disease that humanity struggles with. Sin is deeper than any specific action or group of actions. We each know that we are born into a world that's plagued of sin, that we can't escape it. We have things that theologians call natural evils, like disease or tsunamis or tornadoes. But then there are things within us like greed and jealousy, things that we don't do, but we still struggle with inside that lead to the bad things that we do or the good things that we don't do. But there's something in that still feels like sin. So I like thinking about sin as a disease, as something deeper than any specific action, because it makes me ask, sin is like a disease. Is there an antidote? Is there a cure? And I think kind of there is. And I think that's forgiveness. And forgiveness is not a miracle cure. It's not the perfect vaccine for sin. It's not like as soon as you know that you're forgiven, you become unable to sin, right? I kind of wish that was the case, but it's not. Instead, forgiveness is something that gives us the energy to move forward out of sin and to be free from it. So when we think of sin as pervasive, as something that individuals do, that groups of people do, as bad things that we do and good things that we don't do, it's easy to get overwhelmed and to feel bad. And contrition or repenting from sin seems to be this difficult, impossible, or burdensome task. But as we talked about earlier, Jesus' whole teaching taught us that God is already within us. The temple, the curtain had torn as an image. God is already with us, that we are already forgiven. And contrition, repentance, isn't something that we must muster up on our own strength. It's not something that we have to do all the work for ourselves. Instead, contrition to me is like giving into the gravity of God's love. So I want you to imagine for the next few slides that I'm standing up in front of a whiteboard using my beautiful artistic skills. Instead, you're getting some shabbier drawings that I did on Google Drive, but I'm going to offer a little illustration that kind of helps us understand what I mean when I say the gravity of God's love. So first, there's a circle. Let's imagine the circle represents God. We know God's not the circle or shape. God's something bigger than that. But let's say this circle represents God, and these cute little smiley faces represent us on our own journeys of life and faith. Sin, all of these bad things that we do, these good things that we don't do, which I think may be including to forgive other people, are somewhat like an anti-gravity that pull us away from God. They don't remove God's presence from us, but they make us feel further from the harmony, beauty, and justice that is God's character. However, God is always seeking to draw us nearer. Like we talked about, God, the truth is that God already looks at us with forgiveness. Jesus taught us that we are forgiven not because of anything we do or accomplish, but because of who God is. God's love is always drawing us closer, kind of like gravity, and there are ways to give into God's all-encompassing love, grace, and forgiveness. So sin manifests in different ways, and there are some ways in which we are responsible for the things that pull away from us, but we also have the power to move ourselves closer to God. And there are things that we can do to resist sin and give into God's love that always is pulling at us like gravity. So these cute little green arrows on screen represent the variety of ways that we can practice contrition, that we can repent from our sins. So they can be things like forgiving other people. They can be making up for wrongs that we have done in the past against other people. They can be striving to do good things that we had resisted doing in the past. All these different things that we can do are ways to practice contrition, to give into the gravity of God's love. One of my favorite theologians puts it this way, which I think captures the point. She says, sin is like the dam that holds back the waters of God's grace. Confession is like the breaking of the dam, releasing the divine waters for our thirsty souls. So if we had another 30 minutes, I would go through some of the details on what this contrition will look like. But as Christians, we know that we get to imitate Jesus, who taught about God's all-encompassing love and forgiveness. And he didn't give rules on exactly what we must do to live right, but he invited us into a deeper lifestyle that practices contrition up and down in every way possible, in terms of how we treat others within our own communities, how we treat the poor and those cast out by society, and how we navigate the world and all of its oppression. There are a variety of ways in which we can see what contrition looks like. The point tonight is that contrition isn't this thing that we struggle to do, but instead, as we learn to look and see ourselves in the stories that we have of Jesus, and we learn to proclaim that Christ is risen in our own life, that we can give into God's love that's more like a gravity, not something we have to accomplish or work towards, but something that we give into and become more in tune with. So I see a question in the chat that says, if we don't confess, does God's forgiveness of us still exist? My short answer would be yes. I think Jesus taught that God is forgiveness, that God is love. And that's true of everyone, regardless of one's experience of it. Rather, things like contrition, confessing our sins and moving away from them, doesn't change the reality that's deeper, but rather helps us experience the reality of incarnation and resurrection that was there to begin with. So next week, our word for the week is Christianity. So we talked about creator. Now we've talked about Christ and contrition, because Christ's story compels us to live differently. Next week, we'll talk about Christianity and kind of looking in two different directions. First, what does it mean to practice this contrition? What are some practices that Christians have done over the years? What are some tangible things that we can do to imitate Jesus, to live within the story that we see in the gospel, to practice contrition? And then we'll talk too a bit about what it means to claim Christianity, to proclaim that Christ is risen within a world in which there are a variety of religious traditions. Because I think there's a way that we can proclaim Christ is risen with our own hearts, while also celebrating the truth and beauty that we see across the world in different wisdom traditions. But for now, I want to go back, and I know it's after 8 o'clock, but offer us just one moment or a couple minutes to reflect on what's one insight you've glimpsed tonight and what's one question you've asked. So last week we talked about how theology, talking about God, is not about coming to all of the right conclusions or building the system that makes sense of every issue in the world, but rather it's this dance of insight and questions. And tonight, as we've talked a little bit more about the technical parts of our story as Christians, I'm sure you've had some insights and some questions. So take a moment to write these down, or think of them to yourself, and then I will offer us to close. As we take a minute to do that, are there any questions or insights that people would like to share with the group? Well, the book list and the handout that I sent out does have a few different books that I'd recommend, especially if you're kind of teasing out some of this conversation of what the historical Jesus means connected to this proclamation that Christ is risen. One that I quoted tonight is Monica Coleman's Making a Way Out of No Way, which I really think covers a lot of what we talked about both last week and this week. It has been really formative in my own life. And then another book that I recommended is a book called Saved from Sacrifice by S. Mark Heim. One of the conversations I really try to work into tonight was the conversation about sacrifice and whether or not the cross glorifies sacrifice, or if it's more doorway into a life without sacrifice, which is kind of how I think about it. But if you're confused about one of my professors in seminary called the cross an image of cosmic child abuse, because Daddy God sent his son to die, and that's a hard thing to make sense of, but that's how a lot of Christians have talked about it. There are other ways to understand the cross, and there's at least one book in that book recommendation list that offers some more ways to think about that. S. Mark Heim's Saved from Sacrifice is really formative for me and others, but that's a conversation we can have later. For now, I want to say thank you all for being here tonight. I encourage you to continue questioning and inciting as you dance through your own theological journeys, and we will have tonight's class available online as well if you want to share it with anyone, and we'll be here again next week. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Tyler.